Hi, it's Ashleigh from Sweet Dreams Bake Shop, and welcome back to my channel where I make a lot of cake and cookie decorating tutorials as well as give a lot of baking business tips. So to start off today, I'm going to be showing you my Mocha Buttercream recipe. It's pretty straightforward. It's an American buttercream, so we're going to start with 2 cups of butter. And don't worry if you don't get all of the measurements for this. I'm going to leave the exact recipe down in the description box below. Then I'm going to be adding in some icing sugar. So as you saw there, I always like to give my butter a little bit of a whip first, add a little bit of the icing sugar in, and then a little bit of heavy whipping cream. Now, if you don't want to use heavy whipping cream, you can use anything else like water or just regular milk will do just fine as well. I don't like my buttercreams too sweet at all. We need to balance out the sweetness of the chocolate cake plus all of the decor that we're going to be putting on this. So I want to make sure that this has a really good hit of cocoa. You can also use melted chocolate, but I find with cocoa we're going to get the right texture that I need in order to be able to pipe all of the details. Anytime I want to add a coffee flavor into anything, I always use instant espresso powder. It's the perfect consistency that's not going to block up your piping bag, and it gives a really good hit of coffee. Now I'm adding in a lot of black food gel to get this nice and black. But of course, if you don't want to add that much food coloring, what you can do is you can actually use black cocoa powder, which I recommend. A little cleanup tip, especially if you're using a cake stand like this where it has a lot of grooves, I like to put down a piece of saran wrap or cling wrap on there so that all of those bits can come off rather easily. Obviously, I'm still getting a little fallout here and there of the crumbs, but I just find that way I can lift up that piece and not have everything go everywhere. Now, what I love about this recipe is it's really not that hard to work with at all when you're trying to crumb coat or when you're trying to smoothly cover a cake. To get this really nice and smooth, you can use a torch. I found that I really didn't need to for this recipe because of that butter content and the ratio of butter in there. I find it really smooths out fairly easily. And we're going to be covering a lot of this up with all of this vintage-like piping. Now, I know a lot of people are calling this old school piping or vintage piping. I do that, but then I also add in my own little flair here and there as well, as you can see from all of the glitter that I added in the thumbnail. So what I'm going to be doing right now is I'm using a star tip, and I'm really sorry that I do not film this very well. The problem was that I was also filming a reel at the same time. You can see my phone peeking out there on the other side filming a time lapse, so you missed this little portion. But basically what I'm doing is I'm squeezing my piping bag, and then I'm kind of wiggling things back and forth until we get this really nice pearl border here. And this border actually becomes a little less significant later on because I end up adding a double border. With all of this vintage piping, I find there's lots of stacking and a lot of adding and a lot of detail. You can just choose to make your cakes a little bit simpler, but I'm finding the style right now is to do a lot of different types of borders and a lot of different types of swags. So speaking of swags, let's move on to the swags. So I'm using my number 2 tip here. Now, a lot of people get intimidated by this, but don't. Or at least try not to, because the more intimidated you are, the more timid you are about it, the more chance you're going to have of making a mistake. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to have even pressure squeezing, and I really want you to see how far away my piping bag is. It's not too far to the point where this buttercream is going to break, but it's far enough away that I can control where that line is going to go. Again, this all comes down to the texture of your buttercream. If you don't have that right in the first place, you're going to get really frustrated here. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking a number 4 tip, and I'm just going along the same path that I had the swags on before and doing a double swag. Now, if you are like, I don't know if I can actually get this even and make sure that all my swags are even, you can definitely use a ruler of some sort to make sure that you're getting everything evenly spaced out. On this particular cake, I just kind of hoped for the best, and I've worked on a lot of 6-inch cakes, so I feel like that's why internally I was able to just kind of see how big I should make these swags. If I were working on a bigger cake, it'd probably be a bit of a different story. Now, I'm using the tip number 150 here, but honestly, I feel like to achieve this, I could have used a rounded tip, and I could have done it differently. You'll notice I'm kind of creating some teardrop-like shapes. You can do this with several different types of tips. I wanted to use this tip for something later on, so this is what I ended up doing. And I'm just kind of putting that in between each of those swags. You can see right where it meets. The trick to all of this vintage piping is to keep things very symmetrical. So whatever you do to one side, do it to the other side. One other tip that I also should have mentioned earlier in the video was you don't necessarily need to put this into the fridge after you have coated it with the final coat of buttercream. You could just go ahead and pipe directly on it. But if you're not super confident with piping and you feel like maybe you might make a mistake, definitely put the final coated cake in the fridge first. That way, if you make a mistake with the piping, you can scrape it off and there's little consequence to it. And moving along to the next tip, I was so tempted to buy some drop tips for this tutorial specifically, but I realized a lot of the tips that I already owned really work for this as well. So I'm using a leaf tip here, and I'm just kind of wiggling it back and forth. Now again, if you are not comfortable with creating this rounded pattern with the leaf tip, what I would do first is I would create some sort of rounded swag, or you can use a cookie cutter as well, like a half a cookie cutter, and imprint it in there to follow those lines. I personally like to just do this free-handed, so I'm just wiggling it back and forth. You might notice as you continue to work with your buttercream, if you have really warm hands or you're in a warm environment, you might find that it gets a little bit too loose for you. If you do find that you're losing that definition you want and those crisp edges from your piping tips, then go ahead and re-whip your frosting. This might happen as well if you're a little bit slower with your piping and you just haven't re-whipped in a little while. So go ahead, re-whip it, add a few tablespoons of cocoa powder if you don't want to sweeten it any further. You can add some icing sugar if you would like to, but if you want to maintain all of those flavors, keep them all the same, go ahead and add a tablespoon at a time of cornstarch. This will help thicken things up without sweetening it, but be careful, you don't want to dry out your texture too much, or else you're going to end up kind of with a clumpy looking buttercream instead of having it nice and smooth. And I will say that with American buttercream, you want to whip this for a long time, and make sure that you don't whip it too high because you don't want to create any air bubbles. All right, now we're finally in the home stretch of all of this piping. We're going to use a classic 1M tip to create these swoops on top. It's just like icing a cupcake. You want to make sure that you keep that pressure even as you're squeezing. By the way, if you have difficulty with piping, you can't keep that piping bag closed and pipe at the same time, use a little chip bag clip, or there's also piping bag clips that you can use to make sure it stays shut. I'm going in and I'm adding in all of these little rosettes here. To make a rosette, you just start from the center and you work your way around counterclockwise until you get to the outside. I really don't think they were super necessary. You can't really see them as we're moving very quickly, but go ahead, add some rosettes. Be a little bit extra with this cake. I find with all the vintage type cakes I've been looking at, they're very extra. And if I had cherries available, I would have put them on this cake because I really think that this cake was begging for some red cherries. But unfortunately, didn't have any cherries. I'm going to put on all of these different sprinkles instead, and I'm loving them. I just love this sprinkle mix. And with sprinkles, they do go bad after about 6 months, so I'm really trying to load up because, of course, some of these sprinkle mixes I can't use all year round. So I'm just going to load up my cake with as many sprinkles as possible. And be sure that when you're adding on your sprinkles, you do this when your buttercream has not gone back into the fridge, and you don't want to wait too long or your buttercream will crust up. Now, because of the butter ratio in this, I find it did not crust up very quickly at all. Now, if you're looking for a chunky, edible glitter that doesn't just give your cake a sheen, but actually gives it that glittered look, this Tinker Dust is what you are looking for. It's fully edible, and it really emulates the same look as Disco Dust. I absolutely love it. Going with the silver because we have a bunch of silver sprinkles on there. Now, of course, I mentioned my woes about not having cherries, so I'm going to just use a little bit of this Satin Ice Fondant in red, pre-colored red. I never really like to color my fondant red because it's such a bright, vibrant color. And I'm going to take my little heart cookie cutter here, and then I'm going to place it on the cake. Now, don't worry if things are flopping about a little bit. Just stick it in a little bit further just so it stays nicely. And you'll notice that my hearts are not super thin. If I did them thin, I would have had to let them dry for forever and ever. I always make things just a little bit thicker so that they'll stand up on their own right away. Now, this cake is very me, and I understand that not everybody will be into the dramatics like I am, but I think this cake design would look great in a variety of colors. If you did this with white or a pale pink buttercream, this could look really beautiful and charming. Now let's get into the pricing of this cake, and the pricing is pretty straightforward. For a custom order, this would actually be a little bit cheaper than some of the other cakes you've seen me quote for. It's not covered in fondant, so that brings the price down a little bit. However, if they were very specific about the glitter and the type of sprinkles, that would cause that cost to go up a little bit. For the stock order, it's a lot cheaper because if you have all the buttercream ready in bulk and all of those tips ready and all of the fondant hearts cut out, it's obviously going to be a lot easier to create those designs. Now let's get into the subscriber submission of the video. Did I mention I'm a total sucker for foods that look like other foods? This is amazing. I had to feature it on my channel as soon as I saw it, so be sure to go and check them out. And if you want to be the next featured subscriber submission on my channel, then please follow me at SD Bake Shop on Instagram, where you can either tag me in a photo or send me a photo. Any and all dessert levels are welcome. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can be part of the Sweetie fam. Right now, I'm uploading weekly, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Also, be sure to comment, request, or ask a question. I love hearing from you guys. Bye!